Thanks. What I want to do and what I usually do before I give a talk is a little bit of my background, because I'm a bit of an oddball, and most of the people at Cylance who know me go, yeah, he's an oddball. So I've worked for 2 companies in 27 years. Cylance for about the past 3.5, and Intel for almost 24 years, which makes me unusual. The other thing that's unusual is the fact that I'm not a technologist. I've got an undergraduate in economics, an MBA in finance and accounting, and the first 10, 11 years of my time at Intel was in finance, procurement, business operations, doing some startup stuff until I tripped my way into security. So with that background, I look at the problem set sometimes a little bit differently, and I think about the challenges different than most. So that's the background. That's what's going to inform some of the views that I've got in this talk. You'll find I'm fairly opinionated. We'll sometimes get a little bit agitated, and if a couple curse words come out of my mouth, please forgive me, because they might. With that, why don't we roll the video. When I grew up at Intel, I grew up at the foundation of computing. And what I learned a long time ago, even from the time that Andy Grove was running Intel, was that computing had the power to connect and enrich lives. It had the power to create economic and social benefit. And what you can see in this video is this little girl who got a prosthetic arm. That prosthetic arm was done because of affordable CAD computing, a laptop, cloud computing, and 3D printing. You can see her look here. She was born without, a portion of her arm below her elbow. And I just love the look on her face when she pulls this out. And if you think of the way in which prosthetic devices have historically been done, they take months, tens of thousands of dollars, measurement after measurement after measurement. And if you think of the old way in which prosthetic devices got done, by the time she got that prosthetic arm 6, 7, 8, 9 months later, it might not fit because she would have grown. And because of computing, she can now have a prosthetic device. You can see that look on her face. It's changed her life. She can pick up objects. Think of the benefit that it created, the economic improvement it created that changes a life. For me, that's what computing is about. And that's what security is about enabling. Just like the tagline on my book, protect to enable. If we're just protecting for protection's sake, we're wasting time, we're wasting money. And so think about that when you go back to work. What is the mission of your organization? How do you help achieve that? Now, the real problem I think we have in this industry is a trust problem. Trust is a function of 2 things, competence and character. Competencies are the capabilities you have, the results you deliver. I've been in and around this area now for 17 years. We as an industry have failed to deliver the results. You just look at the news day in and day out. This was breached, that was breached. This occurred, that occurred. The industry has failed to manage and mitigate the risks. And I'll explain more on that as we go through this talk. But some of it has to do with character. What's the intent? What's the integrity? I tell our customers, I tell my peers, and I'll say it here. By and large, you cannot trust the security industry. The security industry, by and large, has not delivered the results we need to manage and mitigate the risks. And when you get to character and you get to intent, the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. I'll say it again. The security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. The vast majority of the industry has no economic incentive to solve the problem. Think of what they're doing, think of the treadmill we've been on, and understand that the vast majority of that industry wants to stay on that treadmill. And so I think you have to look at it as to whether or not you can trust the industry to do what's necessary to manage and mitigate risk for you and your organizations. Now, I give a lot of talks, I'm on a lot of panels, and I get really agitated on certain things. A year and a half or so ago, I was at the ISSA LA conference, and I was on a panel with a group of peers, 5 or 6 of us, and there was a question that came from the audience, and one of the peers on the panel, after making some remarks, just said, you know, accept it, they're going to get in. This statement pissed me off. It always pisses me off. I ended up verbally gutting that individual in front of everybody in the audience. Because for me, this is giving up and giving in. It's accepting the equivalent of digital assault on your customers, on your company, and on your shareholders. And what actually made it more appalling was this CISO was a CISO for a security company. A security company focused on authentication. And I basically said, you just told your potential customers you were not going to do your damn best to protect your enterprise and therefore protect them as their customers. Because if you have an information security event and you've just said they're going to get in, your customers are screwed. Because you're at the back end of authenticating their users and protecting their intellectual property and their information assets. How dare you do that? Again, about a year and a half ago, you guys all go to the RSA conference? So, April of 2017, I registered at the Moscone Center on a Monday morning to get ready to do a talk at 7 a.m. And when I walk out of Moscone West, I'm facing Moscone North, and I see these 4 big billboards. The moment you link business risk to a security incident, that's business-driven security. It pissed me off. I got up on the mezzanine, took this picture. I've used it in a lot of talks ever since. An idiot could link an incident to the business. This is the marketing machinery in the industry that is perpetuating a cycle of accepting compromise. A trademark statement, and I don't know if Art's in the room. Art and I chatted, he's in the back. He made me say, this happened after he left. Gotcha, Art. But when you think about it, the only way in which this is business-driven security is for the security business that's profiting from the pain, profiting from the compromise, profiting from the insecurity of computing. And it was a trademark statement to all keep us in this lull of accepting things as they are versus accepting responsibility to change them. This year at the RSA conference, and I don't mean to pick on RSA, they're just an easy target, particularly since Art left. The theme was now matters. Now has always mattered. I was glad they finally got that right. Because risk is temporal. The decisions we make today affect risk a minute from now, an hour from now, a day from now, and in the context of Meltdown Inspector, 20 years later. Now always matters. And we have to think about the decisions we're making today and their future effect on risk. Anybody watch the keynote for RSA this year? You can still go watch the video. Again, I took the snapshot when I was watching it back because it frankly, again, pissed me off. Rohit's big idea for the industry, his big idea, 1% improvement everywhere. What the hell is that going to do when risk is growing exponentially? Get a little better every day. Well, guess what? I think we've all been trying to do that, and guess what? We've been losing. If a vulnerability has been exploited in the wild, let's patch it. Oh yeah, let's let compromise occur. Let's let business-driven security be about letting incidents occur, increasing our risk, increasing our cost, and creating greater and greater societal risk. Again, think about what you're hearing from the industry. Think about their incentives, think about their motives. Again, his thing was there's no silver bullets. I totally agree with that. You can't eliminate risk, but we can't just go about saying we're going to do a little better every day, because that's not been cutting it for the past couple decades. Most dangerous phrase in language is it's always been done that way. How many of you guys hear that? The compliance stuff that we have to do. I was telling somebody the other night, doing a compliance thing, FedRAMP or PCI or something like that, I have to answer a question of how often I update my DAT and definition files in a compliance regulation. How stupid is that? It's a flawed and insufficient control. Yet the security industry baked it into the compliance regulations. Why? Because they can continue to have their cash cows. That brings me to monkeys and malware. The first time I gave this talk was actually a little over a year ago. And when I got done with it, I was reflecting, and I went home, and that statement, yeah, except if they're going to get in, it continued to grate at me because I hear it a lot from a lot of folks. And peers that I've known for a very long time that I actually think are smart, and it frustrates me as to why they think that they should just accept compromise. So I went to my wife. My wife has her PhD in developmental psychology and emotion and behavior research in early childhood. Actually, she used to use FBI facial coding techniques to figure out what people could mask emotion and lie. It's actually better than lie detectors, so you can't get away with anything in my house. Yeah, my kids were screwed from the beginning. But I asked her about my notion of habits. It's like, you know, what causes us to accept things as they are? First, we make our habits, and then our habits make us. And so then I started going, well, our CISOs habituated to compromise, so therefore accept it. You know, if we've gotten so used to it, we don't think about a different way, a different approach, a different paradigm. And so my wife pointed me to this famous experiment. Now, the reality on this experiment, some of it, if you go look at it on the internet, it's been published for several years now. It's a little bit of a fable, but it has some basis in real research. So there's 5 monkeys in a cage, and in the middle there's a ladder with a banana. Every time a monkey goes up to grab the banana, scientists douse the other monkeys with cold water. And they repeat it and recycle it. What ends up happening after 1 or 2 times, again in this fable that has some real science behind it, the other monkeys would pull the monkey off of the ladder and beat the crap out of him because they didn't like getting doused with cold water. And so they cycle it through for every monkey. And then eventually they start changing out the monkeys, and they stop dousing the monkeys with cold water. And guess what? The monkeys had been habituated to thinking that when somebody would go for the banana, the better thing, the better sustenance, that they were going to be harmed, so they'd beat them up. And I started thinking about it, going, do we tear each other down in the industry for trying to strive to do better? Have you ever had a dialogue with your CIO and say, hey, we need this new thing? Some of you probably did as you were buying Cylance. Hey, there's this new thing. And you had to run a gauntlet to get people to believe that prevention was possible. But you did it. Again, we've got to think about sometimes where we're holding each other back because of the paradigms that we have and the habits we've created and the marketing messages that the industry continues to feed us and feed our management, feed our CIOs and CEOs and CFOs. Incremental change, again, 1% improvement everywhere. That's a step-by-step variation in degree along an established path. It's based upon precedent, and it's intended to do more of the same, but a little bit better. And I'm not saying we shouldn't continuously improve. We all have to do that day in and day out. But the reality is we need transformational change. That's a variation in a different way. It's a reconceptualization and a discontinuity from the initial system. And when you're doing that, that evokes resistance from 2 sources. Fear of separation from what I already know, and fear of failure in attempting to create a leap forward. Those are hard things. Corey mentioned earlier, We're a creative company. We're creationists. You're creationists. We have to continue to transform what we're doing and how we're doing it, because if we continue on the current path, it's going to be a pretty shitty world. Today's reality, I think you guys have felt this. I felt this for years when I was at Intel. ISSA, they do surveys of security professionals. They survey us, and basically what are we saying? We're 100% vulnerable. What are we managing? We're managing to try and minimize vulnerability. Yet when we're surveyed, we say we're 100% vulnerable. Well, why the hell are we in the job if we're letting our companies be 100% vulnerable? We're failing. World Economic Forum, if nobody follows that, it's a great thing to read. They do a risk report every year. 2017, 2018, top 5 risks of the world, along with income and wealth disparity. Climate change, cyber risk has become a societal risk and a social responsibility. Top 5 business risks. #1 business risk. Art said boards in the top 5. World Economic Forum says it's the #1 business risk. Still, it's important. It's critical. We've got to change the way in which we're doing things. Edelman Trust Report comes out about the same time as the World Economic Forum risk report. You walk through it, and it's doing social and economic divides across countries. You know, 2/3 of the world are distrusters. And again, not to make any additional political statements, but you need to just look at our own nation and some of the conflicts that we're having just on philosophical things. Europol, the past few years, and I'm anxiously awaiting their one in October, they review all the cyber crimes in Europe. Basically say acceleration of previous trends, APT and cybercrime boundaries blurring. And they actually claim that most of the attacks are neither sophisticated or advanced. It's a rinse, reuse, repeat cycle. Why? Because again, the controls in most organizations today have not been transformative. Again, they're doing that 1% improvement. And the bad guys can make a 10, 20, 30 exponential changes and get past those things. So why is it when there's a breach, somebody says there's a sophisticated actor behind it? I mean, in reality, it's not that hard to get a user to click on shit and then own their system, right? Particularly when you have traditional products in your environment and controls that are not effective and efficient. $9. Corey mentioned it earlier. I use it in almost every talk. When I got to Cylance, I had been working on my second book, and I always had 3 dimensions of business outcomes I was trying to do at Intel. Because I looked at it and said, what is the shareholder, what does the executive team, what does Andy Grove need from me in my job running security and business continuity? And I looked at it and said, they need 3 things. 1, they need me to create a demonstrable and sustainable bend in the curve of risk. 2, they need me to lower and flatten my total cost of controls. And then 3, remove what I call control friction, because controls are a drag coefficient. They slow down people, data, and business. Now, when I got to Cylance and I was having some discussions, we have a prevention bias, which is great. But in the early days of science, let's just say we were negative on detection and response. The reality is you need all of these controls. And when I was having, honestly, a debate with one of our executives when I first got here, I was like, let me explain how the world works at a macro level. There's 3 ways you can mitigate risk. You can prevent it, detect it, and respond to it. I think we all know that. Risk grows as you go from prevention to response. And then there's 3 macro ways that you can control for risk in your approach: automated, semi-automated, and manual. Cost grows as you go from automated to manual. Now, when you think about it from that dimension, you could go have a dialogue with anybody in your company and they would get that. Get out of the security geek speak. Explain the 9 box to them and where you're at today and what you're trying to do to change things. But again, this 3rd dimension of control friction. And in a high control friction environment, what happens? Your user and business goes around the control. So you put in a control that you think you're controlling for risk, only to have them go around it and have unchecked, unmanaged, unmitigated risk. Now this brings me to my view of where is most of the industry? Now I think you guys are probably in a different spot, but where are most of your peers? They're in the semi-automated to manual detection and response space. You go, why is it? That's not what the business needs. That's not the business outcome we're responsible for delivering. Because that's the highest risk, highest cost, most liable spot for our organizations. So why are we there? Well, if the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing, if it's the highest cost to us, it's the most revenue for the industry. Why do we have high control friction products? Well, guess what? If your user and business goes around the control, there's another risk. If I'm the security industry, I'm going to sell you another tool and another solution because your user just went around you. Why? Because you put a high friction control environment. So we have to think of these dynamics. We've been an industry in a motion, and leaders can distinguish motion from progress. Now, again, the first time, true story, that I drew this, our marketing team said, hey, Malcolm, this is great. This is a great philosophical framework that can help people understand the dynamics and give them tools to communicate internally in business terms. But we're going to redraw the box. And I said, why? They said, well, psychologically, that upper right is the magic quadrant. I was like, that's the flippin' fallacy in this whole thing. That's not magic for us. It might be magic for the industry profiting on us. But what's magic for the security industry and what's magic for us, the magic quadrant's the lower left. We're lower risk, lower cost, lower liability. Being an economist by background, I've always thought of information security as an economic inefficiency. It's a byproduct of vulnerabilities left in technology, sometimes because of crappy design and validation, sometimes because you just can't eliminate risk. And then it gets exploited by mistake or intent. Now, if you think about it that way, you again change the problem set, you change the paradigm, you focus on it differently. And to prove that it's an economic inefficiency, you have to think about what is an economic efficiency. An economic efficiency is where every resource is optimally allocated and the welfare of the population is at its highest level. Again, you just look at where we're at today, broadly speaking, in the information security industry. We're not optimally allocated, and we certainly are not at a spot where the welfare of the population is at its highest level. So by not being economically efficient, by default, we're economically inefficient. And it's because of our approach that we've had. Again, that detection and response. The focus on just incremental improvements, slap a Band-Aid on it, do this, do that, all reactionary, all managing risk to some extent, but not actually getting to the core source of the problem and addressing it. You know, transformational change has been impeded by those mind traps that we get and the behaviors that we've created that keep us in this habitual pattern. That's why I created my 9-box. Gravity is always going to pull you to that upper right because you can't eliminate risk. Shit's going to occur, a mistake's going to happen, but we've got to counteract the gravitational force with constant, not only incremental improvements, but transformational improvements to drive more automation to lower cost, to drive down into constantly trying to prevent the risks, doing real root cause of what occurred, how do I stop it going forward, and then remove the friction that the controls create on the business. You know, we've talked about our predictive advantage. Because of these incremental improvements and the way in which we've been approaching it, the bad guys have had the temporal advantage over us. Further to the point on profiting from the insecurity of computing, 2 years ago, Piper Jaffray, the financial services and brokerage house, did a macroeconomic study. They said there's a 74.1% correlation between security breaches and industry revenue growth. Is that not enough to prove that there's profit motives and problems versus solving them? After WannaCry, again, Fortune, The Guardian, cybersecurity stocks boom. The market cap of the 5 biggest cybersecurity companies rose by billions. How stupid are we to buy more crap from people who sold us shit that didn't work to drive up their stock price, drive up their revenue? That is a problem with us as buyers. What should have occurred and what would have occurred in a normal industry is their stock should have plummeted. Think of the airbags issue a couple years ago, right? Stocks plummeted. You get a product default in a tire, stock plummets for Firestone or Goodyear or whatever. And what are we doing? By and large as an industry, we're buying more crap that doesn't work, staying on that cycle that the industry likes us on. Now, I also, as I mentioned, spend a lot of time thinking about economic issues. Harvard, every few years, does a large macro study on the state of US competitiveness and productivity. And when I read this study 2 years ago, it was astounding to me. Michael Porter, if anybody has read some of the stuff, he's done the competitive models and stuff like that, teaches at Harvard, so he's behind it with a bunch of other economists. And when I was reading the report, they were talking about the fact that productivity in the US, so at a macro level, productivity in the US has been flat to down since the late 90s. And I go, how can that be? We're buying computing for driving economic efficiency and driving benefit, right? It's supposed to give us a cost benefit. So why is it at a macroeconomic level, as we've hockey sticked computing everywhere, has US competitiveness and productivity been flat to down? Now, who knows how it's been the past year or so? GDP has grown a little bit, so there might be a different change. And some of that could be because of the goosing of stimulus. But you go over almost a 20-year period, flat to down. Well, my notion of control friction kicked in. We're spending all this money on IT to give corporate productivity, and at a macro level, the corporate productivity is not actually being noticeable. Is it possible, again, my economic inefficiency, we're spending a few percent a year at a minimum as a part of revenue on most companies on information security. And guess what? We're slowing down the company. We're slowing down time to market. We're adding additional cost. Has our approach to information security stripped away the productivity that IT was supposed to give us? It might have. I haven't done the economic analysis, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And the other part that was in this, that they talked about the disconnect between reality and the discourse occurring. And the misunderstanding of facts is dangerous. Again, I think we've got those misunderstanding of facts in the industry. We're in a sophisticated actor, when in reality it wasn't that sophisticated, right? Advanced adversary. Well, they might have been a nation state, but they were not using it by and large an advanced technique to get in. As I mentioned at the beginning, I really believe that technology can connect and enrich lives, create social and economic benefit. We're at this point where there's so much transformative change that can occur for good in all aspects of things, but only if we get the risk right. And only if we approach this as an economic issue and focus on how do we achieve economic efficiency, which gets back to my 9-box. How do you create sustained progress in what we're doing? We have to constantly drive ourselves towards automation to lower cost, prevention to lower risk, and removal of that friction on the business, on the user, on computing. I'm going to play this other video here.
So the final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put 2 capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the 2 monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is a monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one get a grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber.
Again, paying for the food. Monkey's like going, what hell? What the hell, right?
She tests her rock now.
Checking to make sure the form of payment is good.
And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
I love that video, and it gets back to somebody that was getting cucumber, and the one that got cucumber was pissed. My payment is good, and I'm getting crap, right? I have a lot of discussion with folks on attribution, right? And we all focus as an industry on attribution of threat actor and threat agent. When that's not a controllable variable for us as a CISO, we have no ability to affect the threat actor and threat agent by and large. There's a few things that we might be able to adjust a little bit. But we focus on attribution to that. I had a dialogue with the FTC the other day on some hearings they've got coming up, and I was like, they were like, what can we do? And I said, with every major breach, force the companies to do attribution to the control that failed. Again, visibility. Why? So we can throw that shit back and go get a grape. We got to see what's not working, and we got to do that more broadly. Brings me to a point on business velocity versus business control. The way in which we frame dialogue sometimes is opposing. We create opposing forces just mentally to say control is opposed to the speed of business, and it doesn't have to be that way. That's a design challenge, that's an architectural issue, that's a mindset. 1971, Ford shipped the Pinto. You guys all laugh, you know how the story ends. But a lot of people don't realize Ford had developed the Pinto, the fastest they had ever done a car before. They were faced with competition from Volkswagen, the low-end car market. And they brought the Volkswagen into production 9, 10, 11 months, fastest they had ever done. Lee Iacocca was running the Pinto division at the time. I don't know the man, I wasn't there, but I've read a lot of the research on it and the ethics and the choices and the framing of things that they've done. I don't think that Ford or Lee Iacocca was trying to kill people, but they had a patent on an $11 part to create a safer gas tank, and they didn't put it in the car. They framed the risk as risk to the business, risk to their liability. I've always looked at risk through 3 dimensions. What's the risk to the business? What's the risk to my customer? What's the societal risk I might be creating? All of you need to frame risk in that same way. It'll change the dialogue. It'll give voice to the values. It'll affect a different discussion. Ford didn't do that, and we know what happened. They shipped that car for several years. Now, the backstory on this, that again, a lot of people don't know, it's actually a little bit funny, kind of not, but the advertising agency that was doing radio spots for Ford at the time had done it for a couple of years, and as there was growing evidence that there might be some correlation between side impact and explosions, the advertising agency pulled a radio spot 3 or 4 years before Ford stopped shipping the car. The radio spot left after they did the advertisement that says, buy a Ford Pinto, it'll leave you with that warm feeling inside. The advertising agency saw the irony in that and stopped and pulled the ad. Anybody ever read the book Great by Choice by Morton Hansen and Jim Collins? Fantastic book. If you haven't read it, go read it. They document some stories. One of them is the South Pole expedition in 1911. You had Scott and Amundsen. They left in October. few days apart, several miles apart, with the same goal, to get to the South Pole. One team was a little bit of a ragtag team. The other team was fully funded. They had all this cool stuff. They had the dream team. What ended up happening was Amundsen had a view that victory awaits him who has everything in order, defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take all the necessary precautions in time. They focused on all the risk issues for the journey. They managed every element of it. And what ended up happening was Amundsen's team got to the South Pole, they planted the flag, they got back. 30 days after they did that, Scott's team gets to the South Pole, sees the flag planted, and they all died on the way back. In the book, Great by Choice, they go through a bunch of lessons on not only businesses, but the Scott and Amundsen journey. And they had this view of 10 X'ers: fanatical discipline, productive paranoia, empirical creativity, limitless ambition. Is it limitless ambition to say, except if they're going to get in? No. The basics of this was they had different behaviors, not different circumstances. The choices we make are behaviors. I was in Australia earlier this year and doing a Chatham House Rules dialogue with politicians, CEOs, and CISOs, and a few other things. And a politician who worked for the Prime Minister had said, hey, how would you describe your role as a CISO or a Chief Security and Trust Officer? I said, I'm a choice architect. I'm architecting choices for the business. And if you think about it that way, you change the behavior, you change the dialogue, you ask different questions. You ask the high contrast questions to make sure the right debate and discussion happens. As I tell my kids, you can't talk your way out of something you behaved your way into. You have to behave your way out of it. Formula One cars, I like them as analogies. Why? Because that notion of speed versus control, security versus usability. It's a design and architectural issue. Formula One car, they're taking enormous risk all the time. And everything about what they're doing is designed for speed and safety. Yeah, there's some crashes and people get hurt and stuff, but think about it. Whether it be the brakes, the track, the spoiler on the back of the car is to create cohesion towards the mission. How often are our controls designed to create cohesion towards the business mission? By and large, they're not. That's our responsibility to change that. And then when you think about the operating stuff, you know, the discipline, the control, the communication, the collaboration between the driver and the pit crew, again, is all designed for that mission. Think of your SOC. Is it designed with the communication, the discipline, the communication to interact with the user to get them back on the road as fast as possible? Think about the interactions between the SOC and the network team or the help desk. Are they designed to work in cohesion towards the business mission? Many times not. That's our responsibility to change that. Because I think you can get business velocity and business control. National Transportation Safety Board says it all the time, speed kills, right? Businesses need velocity. Velocity is speed with control, speed with discipline. For anybody who was in our session yesterday, Juan talked about this, and he used the same analogy. We actually hadn't compared notes. Because again, the braking system. Because you've got brakes, you can move faster. So again, think of how you articulate the controls and how they can be used to achieve the business mission and achieve business velocity. I like to tell stories, as you can see. One of them that I love is what I call prevention in Panama. So for decades and decades and decades, people were trying to figure out how to build the equivalent of the Panama Canal so that ships didn't have to go around Cape Horn and take that long journey and spend all that time. The French started in the late 1800s with a real effort to try and figure out how to do that. They had just built the Suez Canal, and they figured since they did that, they could build the Panama Canal. But they didn't account for a lot of things. The Suez Canal was built at sea level, so they went to build the Panama Canal at sea level. But when you get 200 inches of rain a year, guess what? everything washes away. Architectural issue. But the other problem that was occurring was that tens of thousands of people were dying annually as workers from malaria. And what they did if you didn't die was they gave you quinine. And quinine left most of the workers deaf. It was toxic. So imagine you're digging a ditch. You survived malaria and you've had quinine, and now you get sent back to dig a ditch and you can't hear. How safe is that? Right? Not very. Now, speed up the clock. In 1903, Panama declares its independence. 1904, US takes over the Panama Canal Zone. Construction begins a few years later. And then literally in a few years, Panama Canal is built and opened. You go, what happened? Well, one, architectural change. We're not going to build at sea level. We're going to move up to the mountains, hence the lock system. That was a critical change in architecture to change the outcome. But there was still a core problem with malaria. And what ended up happening was Major Ronald Ross discovered that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes in late 1903, early 1904, as all this was occurring. And the control of malaria was actually vital to the construction of the Panama Canal. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had the workers to do the work. Or they would have been left deaf and still had the problems. And what they ended up doing is they had Colonel Gorgeous. He formed a sanitization zone in 1904. Because now that they knew that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes, they went through and systematically figured out where the breeding ground for mosquitoes were and how to go about systematically removing those breeding grounds and removing the vulnerability that was then causing the heart of the issue. And the results of it were astounding. Eradicated yellow fever across all of Panama. And in just a few short years, a 10-fold drop in the death rate for workers, an 8-fold drop in the death of all people in Panama. Amazing results because they understood the core issue, the core vulnerability, and they addressed it. And then what did that do at the turn of the century? Because they actually properly controlled for risk, think of the economic boom that occurred and how that then changed the world. And again, if you think of things like the Panama Canal and the economic efficiency, and you think of where we're at with computing, if we control for these risks right up front in the design and development validation of technology, and then post-implementation, focus on predictive, preventative capabilities, the economic efficiency, the social benefit we can create with technology is enormous. Now, the lessons for security in this, no Pollyanna view. You can't eliminate risk. Malaria wasn't eliminated, but the root cause was identified. They put in systematic controls to prevent it, and then dramatic worldwide benefit occurred. We can do the same thing for computing. I think Cylance is doing that same thing for computing. But it's going to take all of us to demand more of that from the security industry to change the risk dynamics. I like quotes. Love this one from Michelangelo. Greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but it's too low and we reached it. That's too low, folks. And guess what? That's low. And that's even lower when we, the ones responsible for managing and mitigating our risk in our enterprise, give up and give in and just say, hey, you know what? They're going to own us. Don't do that. Don't accept that. Demand better of your peers. Demand better of your team. Demand better of the security industry. And privacy should be included as well, not as an afterthought. And this is not a picture of the men's room here, but that's not privacy by design. Now, that was actually a Photoshop picture. I was in Ireland last fall, and I actually went into a bathroom, and there was a bathroom that looked like that. And I'm like, okay, that's not privacy. You know, it's funny. I don't know if Art's still here. A few years ago, when he was still at RSA, post-Snowden, I was on an analyst call with Security Business Innovation Council. And Art was talking about the balance between security and privacy, and I let him finish the statement. I said, hey, Art, you got it wrong. It's not a balance. It's a design and architectural issue. security and privacy are like two magnets. When turned one way, they're perfectly binding. But if security doesn't understand the nuances of privacy, it's not designed with privacy in mind, it will create a destruction of privacy and create problems and challenges. Just like if privacy stays too academic and ethereal, it doesn't practically get into the proportionality and some of the other issues. It's like taking those two magnets and turning them, and they polarize. Don't think of them as opposing forces. Think of them as, how did I design those magnets where the polarity is together, because you need good security to have privacy. It's also one of the reasons why I love the way in which Cylance is architected and what we're doing. We don't have to bulk collect machine data, shove it to a cloud, and expose the personal information of your users, the intellectual property of your company, like all those other solutions are doing. Why? Because we've gotten to the source of the problem. We prevented it. Yeah, we collect some information, but by and large, we're not bulk collecting that machine data. We've architected with privacy in mind with everything we've done. Another quote, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. We have controversy in this industry. We have the equivalent of a religious ideological debate and divide. Those that think that prevention is possible, and those that just say, accept that they're going to get in, detect, and respond. It is the equivalent of that type of ideological debate. You're always going to need detection and response, but what we have to do is, again, challenge that notion. Expect better, demand better. Because if we don't, if we continue the risk curves that we have today, and instead of connecting and enriching lives, we're going to connect and destroy them. We're almost at that precipice already because of the crappy job we've done as a society. Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State in the late 90s, during the Rwanda and Bosnia crisis, she coined a doability doctrine, and I love it, where our interests are clear and our values are at stake and we can make a difference, we must act and we must lead. We have to have a doability doctrine in this industry. It's absolutely clear that this is a values issue. And so much is at stake today and in the future with the choices that we make. And we have to act and we have to lead. Again, leaders can distinguish motion from progress. Constantly think about how you're driving progress towards a reduction in risk, towards focusing on how do you lower and flatten your total cost of controls. How do you get controls that are designed that remove the friction on the business, on the user, and on computing? Again, stop being habituated to compromise. I think you guys already have. But for all of us, including Cylance, hold us accountable. Drive us harder to continue on the path that we are. Demand grapes, not cucumbers. You know, throw that crap back. And Renee mentioned yesterday, and I know I'm out of time here, that we were sponsoring an enterprise cyber security leadership program. I helped create it with Colin Powell and a few others as I was leaving Intel, and it's a 12-week online course. We've got scholarships that we've created. There's going to be permanent 25%, in essence, scholarship discounts for all of our customers. We're going to be announcing it more publicly in October for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Again, it's a leadership issue, which is why I spend so much time focused on leadership and driving folks to do better. So if you haven't signed up for the raffle of that stuff, please do. And if you don't win it, but you want to learn more about it, hit me up. We'll give you the website. Again, we've got discounts for it. With that, thank you.